In this chapter, chapter 14, we talk about the Federal Reserve System. This would be the central bank in the United States, and probably the biggest qualifier to add to all of this is don't let the word federal at the start of it make you think that it's part of the federal government. It is not. The central bank, its design is that it's um, at least operates independent of politics and politicians for the most part. And um, really, when we think of the word federal in this case for Federal Reserve System, we think of the word federal as a way in which we are trying to link up or combine regions of the country into one central decision making body, which in this case would be the Federal Reserve System. So, in the previous chapter, we were talking about banks and like the banks that you and I all go to, depository banks, right, where we make deposits, we get loans. That system was the only banking system that existed up until 1913. And then in 1913, after a particularly um, severe banking crisis, um, the kind of the wheels were set in motion to create a central bank. The United States had central banks before, um, going all the way back to um, Alexander Hamilton, um, and I think we had a first national bank, and I think we had a second. We might have even had a third. Um, I think the last one ended with oh, what's his name? The guy who, the president who had a, the president who, when he died, his parrot. So the guy, the dead president owned a parrot. The parrot went to the funeral, and the parrot got kicked out of the funeral for swearing too much. I mean, come on, dude. Um, that's a pretty cool parrot. Andrew Jackson. Let's test my history knowledge here. Did Andrew Jackson have a parrot who swore? Yeah, look at that. He died June 8th, 1845, seventh president, and the bird's name was Pole, who squawked, squeaked, and swore like a sailor. No, that's yeah. See, history is interesting. Okay, that is not on a test. It's just a cool fact. Um, what the central bank does then is one of the central features of what it does is it both manages, sets up regulations that banks follow, as well as control the money supply. Um, and we'll talk about how it does that. Okay, so let's talk about what the Federal Reserve System looks like. The Federal Reserve System is 12 regional banks. These 12 regional banks that are owned by banks in that region, depository banks in that region. Um, I mean, clearing checks. I mean, yeah, people do still write checks. I write a lot of checks, but um, I'm 46, so like that's in my age group that I write checks. People Zelle and you um, all those cash apps and stuff. I don't really do that. I write checks, so don't be my friend because you'll get checks from me. Um, the the regional Federal Reserve offices also hold bank reserves for banks in that region. They provide currency. When we say provide currency, what we mean is that dollar bills that look really ratty and whatnot, they replace those with newly printed. So it's kind of like maintaining the currency. And then the final thing that the Federal Reserve System does, among other things, is it provides loans. In this sense, it provides loans to banks that are suffering some problems, which in this case means it's not good when a bank has to borrow from the Federal Reserve. Now, we should look at this because I don't think. Does it have a map? Oh, it doesn't have a map. Okay, just wait. Let me get back to this. Now we'll go back to the parrot. So the map of what the 12 districts looks like is it looks something like this. You can see that when it was drawn in 1913, it reflected a country where most of the economic activity was on the East Coast and somewhat in the Midwest. But that you have large regions like District 12 that covers a really wide swath of territory. Each of these regions then creates specialties. So my first job out of college was at the in District 7 at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. And I spent a lot of my time doing research on railroads. Why railroads? Railroads were important in that region because what they did is they were the way in which auto manufacturers got their supplies. So we spent a lot of time on railroads. District 9, they spend a lot of time on agriculture, especially on wheat production. They also spend a fair amount of time, interestingly enough, on Native Americans and look at kind of create an economic atlas for Native Americans. District 8, the St. Louis district, is really well known for creating FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, used a lot. New York, District 2, is probably the most important district, and that's because it's in basically, um, the stock market, the bond market, most of the markets are all formed in New York. Um, those are just a few of the probably the most well known or distinguishable um, banks. Okay, so there's our map. Now, these 12 districts all report to a board of governors. That board of governors has 7 members. Those 7 members are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So now you're seeing a little bit of political influence here, right? You got to be appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. But you serve so long that you outlast most presidents. Then there's one board member of those 7 who's kind of the leader, right? The chairman of the board of governors. And that's probably the name most of you would be familiar with. As of right now, it's Jay Powell. But, right, if we look at the other names, you're not going to have heard of most of these names. I will, obviously. I know who they are, but I suspect most of you will not. Here we go. Jerome Powell, again, our chair that we would all know. Chris Waller, I knew him. He was at Notre Dame when I was at Notre Dame. Lisa Cook, I think, is the crazy one. No, she's not the crazy one. There's a really crazy one. Well, it could be Michelle. Is it Michelle? No, she's not the crazy one. There's a really, really crazy one. I think she's crazy. That's not her. Oh, it's gonna bother me. I don't remember who it is. Well, anyway, here's our 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Philip Jefferson doesn't get any love. He's the vice chair. But yeah, again, Chris Waller, he was at Notre Dame when I was there. Then he worked at the St. Louis Fed, or he was at the St. Louis Fed for quite a bit of time. And yeah, okay, let's go back to the slides. So there we go. We've got our board of governors, who are 7 members. Then you've got 12 banks that represent the 12 regions. And then those banks actually have branches. So the branches, what they do is they try to coordinate some of the economic activity. In District 12, for instance, there is a branch in Salt Lake, I think, Seattle, LA, San Francisco, and Phoenix, I think. So we have quite a few branches because it's covering a very large territory. All right, and so on and so forth. So you've got 12 banks in the Federal Reserve System. You got your 7 board of governors. Now, what they do, interestingly enough, is that we've got the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, which buys and sells existing U.S. government debt. It consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors. Then it always consists of the president of the New York branch, District 2. He used to be the president of the San Francisco branch. The San Francisco branch now, by the way, is the president of the San Francisco district is Mary Daly, a really interesting and highly respected economist. And sorry, where I was going with this is that there are the FOMC, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors, always the New York branch president, and then 4 rotating members of the remaining 11 branches. So why is that important? Because that means then that if you're one of those bank presidents that's voting on this open market committee, you're helping to determine with your vote what the interest rates are generally going to be in the U.S. economy through the buying and selling of existing bonds. So let's talk about what this FOMC does. The FOMC basically pays attention to what's going on in the market. It looks at economic data. And then when they meet about every 4 to 5 weeks, they then decide, do they need to adjust the money supply in order to reach a certain economic goal? Sounds really simple, right? If we look at in a very basic sense, now this kind of dates back. This dates back to, let's imagine that we're in the time period before the 2008 financial crisis. If we were taking this class back then, this would be the only 3 tools that existed: changing reserve requirements, changing the discount rate, and open market operations. Let's talk about each of these. So banks only have to hold a certain amount in reserves, what's called the required reserve ratio. They have to keep these required reserves either in cash in their vaults, or they have to hold it as a deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank. The idea is that they can lend out everything beyond that required reserve ratio. So, if the Federal Reserve was to lower the required reserve ratio, banks could lend more money, which would mean that the money supply would go up. If they raised the reserve ratio, then banks can't make as many loans, so the money supply would fall. Now, the reality of this is that banks, they don't really hold, they're not really required to hold any reserves anymore. The reserve ratio was basically eliminated in early 2020 with COVID as an attempt to kind of rescue the economy from a rather weak recession that we were having. And it didn't really matter even when they eliminated it, because banks were already holding quite a bit in what we would call excess reserves, reserves beyond Presumably now, right? All reserves are excess reserves. But even if we just look at this, it's now discontinued, um, primarily because it's so big. I mean, look what happened here after the 2008 crisis, and then especially after with COVID. Banks are holding a lot of money in reserves. They're not lending it out as much. And also, too, remember, banks are the ones that own they're the ones that own shares in the Federal Reserve Bank. They're the ones that select the president of the regional Federal Reserve banks. So the Federal Reserve doesn't really want to piss off banks either, and all of a sudden change reserve ratio such that banks now have to, do something different. In this case, um, this isn't really a tool that's used very often. So again, to repeat myself, whatever the bank holds beyond its required reserves would be called excess reserves. And we can kind of see this kind of very simple math here of if we hold a certain amount in deposits and we multiply it by the required reserve ratio, we can then find the required reserve amount. We can then subtract those required reserves from the total amount of deposits to find the excess reserves. And this just repeats what I said. Where the money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio, that as we change the required reserve ratio, again, what we see is that let's see here. Right, as we change the required reserve ratio, let's draw here. I just want to draw. So 1 over the required reserve ratio, RRR, right, is that when it's 10%, the money multiplier is 10. If I then raise the required reserve ratio to 20%, the money multiplier is now 5. The reason why that money multiplier is important is because the Federal Reserve does the first amount of increase in the money supply, right? But let's say it buys $1,000 in bonds. Well, then the money supply is going to increase by 1,000 initially because the Federal Reserve, kind of makes the money out of thin air to buy that bond. Then you multiply it by whichever money multiplier we're operating on. Let's say we're operating on the 10% required reserve ratio. So now what we would see is that the money supply would change by 10,000 if the central bank wanted to reduce the money supply. All they would have to do is raise the required reserve ratio, right? And now we would decrease the amount of money supply that would change. Okay. And so you can kind of do this kind of simple math, and you'll see that here. The second tool would be the discount rate. The discount rate is, again, the interest rate that that the Federal Reserve charges when you borrow from it. It's not, again, a very nice tool to use because, one, you don't want to discourage banks in trouble from borrowing from it just because the interest rate's too high. And also, banks don't really want to borrow from the Federal Reserve because if you borrow from the Federal Reserve, it is likely, in fact, next to impossible, that you won't get asked, why do you need the money? So this is the equivalent of borrowing money from mom and dad. You're likely to be asked why you need the money and what are you going to do with it. And then everyone, investors especially, are going to be like, what's going on at this bank that they need to borrow from the Federal Reserve? Instead, banks usually will try to borrow from each other and pay interest. that interest rate is known as the federal funds rate. And that's when banks borrow from each other some of their excess reserves. But it's only an overnight loan because banks don't really trust each other, right? They don't really know what's going on in the balance sheet. So they want to be able to say, every day we can call in that loan and say, we're not going to give it to you anymore as business conditions change. So what that would mean is that if you're borrowing from the Federal Reserve, they're giving you money they just created. So raising the discount rate would mean that banks wouldn't borrow from the Federal Reserve as much. So that would reduce the money supply. If we lowered the discount rate, banks would be encouraged to borrow from the Federal Reserve. So the money supply would increase. But again, not likely that this has much impact because there's a variety of reasons why no one would want to borrow from the Federal Reserve. So, out of the three tools so far, we've kind of dismissed the first and the second. And so, what that brings us to talking about again is the federal funds market. This again is banks borrowing from each other, and the federal funds rate would be the interest rate that's paid when you borrow money from each other. So, why is that important? Because the interest rate that banks charge each other to borrow would be based on how much excess reserves they have to lend out. And the Federal Reserve can influence how much reserves a bank has by either buying or selling existing government bonds that these banks hold. So banks can't buy stocks. Banks buy U.S. government bonds and government-sponsored equity bonds, like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, TVA, government-sponsored agencies. So they buy these bonds and then they can sell these bonds, and they could buy and sell these bonds from the Federal Reserve. It's either creating the money to buy the bond, or when it's selling a bond, it receives the money from these banks and then destroys it. Thus, the Federal Reserve is influencing the federal funds rate by giving banks either more or less reserves. It does this in a way that's called, the open market operation. The Federal Reserve can again buy bonds. If the Federal Reserve buys bonds, it leads to reserves increasing, which then means that more loans can be made. And in essence, the federal funds rate would fall. Or if the Federal Reserve, Fed, when we say the Fed, we mean the Federal Reserve Bank. When the Fed sells these government bonds, then reserves would decrease, and now banks are not going to be able to make as many loans, and so the federal funds rate would increase. And that's what we see right here. So, when we look at this overall structure here, what we can see as well is that what's important when we're trying to understand what a bond is that a bond, when we think of the two most important markets in the United States, we have an equity market, which are stocks, and a bond market. Bonds are basically loans, and the bond will say how much are you borrowing, how long do you have to pay it off for, and what's the interest rate that you're going to pay for it. What people who invest in bonds care about is the yield. What's the rate of return on the bond? That's going to be determined by two things, the bond yield. Both how much you're getting in annual interest from that bond, and also what price did you pay for the bond. Now that might seem a little odd for you, right? So consider this. What if I want to borrow, actually, let's just use the example of my mortgage. So I got my mortgage in the year 2000, or 2000, in 2020. And in 2020, the mortgage bond, essentially, it has a fixed 2.875% interest rate. And at the time that I borrowed the money, right, I borrowed, right, $1 million, and it was worth $1 million. But now, in the year 2023, the interest rate for mortgages right now is about 7 to 8%. So now, let's say that the bank that I borrowed the money from wants to sell my mortgage to someone else, which they can do. How much would a bank pay for my mortgage? Let's say I didn't make any payments. They're not going to pay $1 million for my $1 million mortgage. Why? Because it's paying a 2.875% interest rate, which is much lower than the current 7 to 8% interest rate. So to get it sold, you're going to have to offer a discount to make it a little bit cheaper, to encourage me to buy that bond that's paying a really bad interest rate. Same thing goes on with bonds, right? Is that the interest rate is fixed, generally speaking, at the time it's issued, which then means as the interest rate changes in the future, falls or rises, then what happens is that the bond price then either falls or rises. And that's what you see right here. So the goal then of the open market operation, as kind of the bottom part of this would be, is that what they're trying to do is by changing the amount of money supply that's out there, they're trying to alter the price of bonds, thus changing their yields. The idea being that if they can lower the price of bonds, then the yield will become higher. And how would they lower the prices? They would do that by raising interest rates. And how would you get higher prices for bonds? Then you would be lowering the interest rate, because that would make the bonds that were previously issued just more valuable because they're paying a higher interest rate. Again, the idea here as well is that with an open market operation, the Federal Reserve can encourage people to buy the bonds at a certain price by selling them at that certain price. And again, as a bond is sold, then the public pays for it, the reserves fall, and the money is basically destroyed by the Federal Reserve once it's paid. And it can buy them at a higher price. As the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee buys bonds, then the Federal Reserve is going to be paying the public for these bonds, and bank reserves are going to rise, which would be, you'd get more money supply. Now, what becomes a little bit important here, although I don't want to spend too much time on it, and it's not, it's just interesting to talk about, is that the realization was reached quite quickly in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, as bad as it was that we had lowered the interest rate to zero through open market operations, and the problem was still really, really bad. Same thing happened during COVID as well. The only thing that we could do as a central bank is engage in what's called quantitative easing, or QE. And what that means is that you're now not just going to buy US government bonds. You're going to buy anything and everything. So that's what they mean by aggressive open market purchasing. They're going to buy anything and everything in an attempt to really make the interest rate low. So you're buying corporate bonds, you're buying mortgages, you're buying auto loans, you're buying anything and everything that moves, and just putting a lot of money into the system. Let's see. Right, if we look at this, we certainly see that here, right? We see the money supply growing quite dramatically in the months and the short time after COVID, right? And if we go back, right, it pales in comparison to the amount that we increased it um, during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It's why we're seeing such inflationary problems right now, still in 2023, because we did increase the money supply so dramatically. And so there we go. This kind of just repeats what I've already said here. But the Federal Reserve, probably its most visible activity it engages in, again, are these open market operations where it's buying and selling the existing government bonds. Okay, so then these two slides would be important, slides 25 and 26, because it pretty neatly and succinctly summarizes how you would increase the money supply and decrease the money supply, which then becomes important for chapter 15.